What if the kindest people in the British royal family were the ones you have barely heard of? Behind the gilded gates and the scandal-soaked headlines, a few of them quietly broke the mold, writing letters in secret, visiting hospitals with no camera present, hiding entire families through a war. No press, no spectacle, only decency in the shadow of a dynasty obsessed with its own image. These are the stories the histories never led with, because kindness, unlike a crown, does not sparkle, it simply endures. What follows are 18 of them, drawn from across 2 centuries, and each one chose goodness in a place built to reward the opposite. Some of them wore the crown, most never came close to it. What unites them is not rank but instinct, the refusal to let privilege harden into indifference. Begin with Princess Alice of Battenberg. She was born in Windsor Castle, and she died in a borrowed bedroom. The mother of Prince Philip, grandmother to a king, she lived most of her life with the kind of invisibility that only royalty can afford. Deaf from birth, diagnosed with schizophrenia in an age when the word was very nearly a sentence, and exiled more than once, she was expected to fade quietly from the picture. She did not. She made a habit, instead, of defying the world's worst expectations of her. During the Nazi occupation of Greece, Alice lived in a modest apartment in Athens. She wore plain clothes, refused to flee, and spent her days organizing soup kitchens and sewing circles for the poor. And beneath the floorboards of that apartment, she was hiding members of a Jewish family, the Cohens, directly under the eyes of the Gestapo. When they came to question her, she played the part of a doddering old deaf woman until they tired of her and left. The family she sheltered were the Cohens, a widow and 2 of her children, kept hidden in those rooms for the length of the occupation, fed from a household that had almost nothing to spare. They had no idea they had been speaking to someone the state of Israel would one day name among the righteous among the nations. Alice took holy vows, founded an order of Greek Orthodox nursing sisters, and asked to be buried in Jerusalem rather than Westminster. By the end, she owned almost nothing at all, not because it had been taken from her, but because she had given it all away, including, it seems, her own claim to be remembered. The palace made little of her after her death, which is its own quiet irony, and given that her son would spend a lifetime walking 3 steps behind someone else. The second is the woman who walked in front. Elizabeth II reigned longer than any monarch in British history, but behind the pearls and the televised wave, the late Queen was known among her staff for something far less photogenic, a relentless kindness worn into the grain of routine. She was not warm, not exactly, but she was unwaveringly civil, and that is a discipline that either maddens a person or makes them feel safe, depending on which side of the rope they stood. Former aides spoke of how she remembered birthdays, not because a secretary had written them down, but because she cared to. By most accounts, she wrote hundreds of condolence letters in her own hand, alone, late into the night, with no speechwriter and no camera anywhere near. In the leaner years, she paid staff wages from her own private funds rather than let people go. She did not raise her voice, and she would not let anyone raise theirs to a footman. To the public, she was a symbol. To her family, she was a fortress. But to the people who spent their lives beside her, the chauffeurs and the secretaries and the cleaners, she was a steady human presence inside a house built on illusion. And when the tabloids raged and the scandals broke, she did not flinch. She walked the dogs, wrote the notes, and did the work. The red boxes of state papers followed her everywhere, to Balmoral and to Sandringham, opened and read and returned every single day of a reign that ran 70 years, because she had decided long before that the work did not pause for weather or for grief, which leaves the real question. How does a person remain kind while being the most watched woman alive? The third was forged in fire, much of it his own. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was famously blunt, maddeningly tactless, and deeply allergic to anything resembling emotional display. But beneath the sharp tongue and the rigid military bearing was a man who, by the account of those nearest him, spent his life shielding the people no one else noticed. He made a discipline of absorbing blame. When something went wrong behind closed doors, junior staff have said it was often Philip who stepped in to take the fall and spare the younger ones. He visited injured servicemen with no cameras present, wrote quiet checks to pay for their care, and championed technical education for working-class youth long before it was fashionable to do so. At the award scheme he founded in 1956, the one that still carries his name, has since driven millions of young people up mountains and out of their own comfort, and he intended every part of it as a leveler. To his wife, he was a kind of private peacekeeper. When she came under siege, whether public or political or personal, his loyalty was never loud, but it was absolute. The Queen called him her strength and stay, and quaint as that sounds, it is the phrase of someone who has seen the worst in people, used to describe the one who never left. Philip disliked fuss, disliked flattery, disliked anyone pretending to be something they were not. And perhaps the reason so many overlooked his kindness is that it never looked like kindness at all. He never asked to be liked. He simply guarded everyone around him as though it were his appointed task. The fourth refuses, to this day, to be protected. If one royal treats royalty itself as an inconvenience, it is Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, the only Windsor who could pass without comment for a woman who works at the post office. Punctual to a fault, blunt, and entirely without patience for fluff, she has never cared for cameras or ceremony. But beneath the no-nonsense surface is something far harder to imitate, a lifelong and unpretentious devotion to service. She visits wounded soldiers unannounced and unpublicized, often unscheduled, and the hospital staff describe her habit of staying long past the official program, asking real questions, remembering names, offering conversation rather than royal platitude. At a charity, she insists on walking the grounds, meeting the workers, hearing the dull and necessary details, the budgets and the staffing and the logistics. She does not pose for the emotional moment. She waits until it is over, and then she thanks the caretaker. She refuses an entourage, carries her own bags, and keeps a pace her own staff struggle to match. She shuts down flattery wherever she meets it. "Treat me like anyone else," she has said, more than once, and she means it. It would be easy to call this mere pragmatism, but when a person chooses the unglamorous work for decades, without applause and without self-promotion, it stops being a quirk and becomes a character. The fifth made being feared into something oddly generous. Queen Victoria is rarely called kind, stern certainly and stubborn, and often emotionally locked away. But behind the portraits of the grieving widow in her black lace was a woman whose private conduct toward those below her station revealed a surprisingly steady and largely invisible streak of decency. For all the rigidity of her rule, Victoria personally arranged pensions for elderly servants, funded the schooling of their children, and paid the medical bills of wounded soldiers long after the state had forgotten them. She did it without fanfare, without titles attached, and often without the recipients ever knowing where the money had come from. She kept careful records of her household, noting birthdays and illnesses and deaths in the family, not for show, but because she believed it her duty. After Albert died, she became a recluse. Yet even then, she stayed bound to the working people who had shown her real loyalty. Her long and controversial closeness to her Scottish servant John Brown, and later to her Indian attendant Abdul Karim, was less rebellion than a deep and human longing for something honest. She repaid loyalty with protection and kindness with quiet elevation. She ruled an empire steeped in contradiction. But within her private rooms there was a sovereign who, however shut down she was, rarely forgot the humanity of those who served her. Which brings us to the man who taught her to see it. The sixth was the outsider. Prince Albert, the prince consort, German-born, suspiciously intellectual, forever in the shadow of his sovereign wife, may have understood the soul of Britain more deeply than most of its kings. And unlike most royal husbands, he spent far less time pursuing power than pursuing reform. Sir Albert used his position not to raise himself, but to press for better housing, cleaner factories, and education within reach of ordinary people. He privately funded schools for the working class, sat through lectures with industrialists, and pushed Parliament to confront the use of child labor at a time when such concerns were dismissed as sentimental. His own money went towards scholarships rather than yachts. He was precise in his conduct, always courteous, unfailingly gentle with servants, and he had a gift for putting nervous visitors at their ease, usually by discussing science, theology, and plumbing in roughly that order. He disliked attention and despised flatterers. He preferred data and logic and action. His influence on Victoria ran deep. She later admitted that everything good in her had come from him. And when he died young, her grief was not merely personal. It was the collapse of her moral compass. His legacy lies in architecture, in education, and in the quiet redirection of a monarchy that had been drifting toward decadence. He left no throne behind him, only a higher standard. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was his doing, and when it turned a profit, he poured the money not into his own name, but into the cluster of museums at South Kensington that still teach the public for little more than the cost of getting there. The seventh inherited that standard and carried it into the wards. Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, was the only daughter of King George V, and she seemed to take the family creed of duty and make it a personal vow rather than a performance. Quiet, steady, and genuinely involved in the causes she took up, she never sought the spotlight and never stopped appearing. Through both world wars, she visited military hospitals across Britain and beyond, offering not handshakes and photographs, but hours of unrecorded and unglamorous work, writing letters for the soldiers who could not, sitting with the men whose families had abandoned them, and returning to visit them long after the press had lost interest. The nurses recalled her calm and her willingness to take on the menial tasks. She did not perform empathy, she practiced it. She used her own inheritance to fund housing for disabled veterans, oversaw the building of it herself, and refused to attach her name to most of it. Her wartime work was not a phase. It became the rhythm of her life. She did not vanish between the wars. She kept visiting, kept writing, kept giving. She married late, lived modestly, and seemed indifferent to royal privilege. Her legacy rests not on monuments or scandals, but on the testimony of people who watched her walk into rooms most royals never even acknowledged. In the first winter of the Great War, a girl of 17, she funded a small brass box of tobacco or sweets for every sailor and soldier serving the crown, hundreds of thousands of them, and saw to it that they reached the front by Christmas. The 8th, when the bombs came down, stayed exactly where the people were. In another life, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, might have been a society hostess. In the life history handed her, she became a wartime icon, not for her speeches, but for her stubbornness. When Buckingham Palace itself was bombed during the Blitz, she is remembered as saying it allowed her, at last, to look the East End in the face, the meaning being that now she too had lost something. She could stand beside the people who had lost everything. But the stories that last are less about where she lived than where she went. She visited the bombed streets not only for morale, but to listen. She appeared in grief-stricken neighborhoods with no press entourage, offering comfort rather than statements of comfort. Survivors recalled her warmth, her willingness to linger, her habit of writing back to people she had met only once. Decades later, she was still in contact with families from those visits, keeping up long correspondences with widows and shopkeepers and former evacuees. And unlike many, she remembered the names. Behind the pastel hats and the perfectly set curls was a woman who used tradition as armor, but never as an excuse. She believed in monarchy as a bond rather than a brand, and she behaved accordingly. She refused, too, to send her daughters to safety abroad while the bombs fell, reasoning that the children would not go without her, that she would not go without the king, and that the king would never go at all. Which leads us to her husband, the reluctant king, who never wanted the power and carried it with grace. The ninth, George VI, was never meant to be king at all. That honor, if it was one, belonged to his elder brother, Edward VIII. But when Edward chose scandal over sovereignty and abdicated the throne, George was thrust into the crown like a soldier sent to a war he had not started. An anxious, stammering man with a deep sense of his own inadequacy, he had every reason to turn bitter. Instead, he became something far rarer. He became gentle. Within Buckingham Palace, the staff remembered him, not as a ruler, but as a listener. He treated his servants as people, thanked them in person, noticed when they fell ill, and never raised his voice. He wrote to wounded soldiers in his own hand, not because the office required it, but because he understood what it meant to receive such a letter. He did not want the crown, but he wore it like a man who knew it weighed heavier on everyone else. Through the Blitz, he walked the bombed-out streets beside his wife, absorbing the grief of strangers with the awkward dignity of a man who feels too much and says too little. History tends to forget the kings who avoid drama, but his great accomplishment was never surviving a war. It was modeling decency under pressure. He forced his stammer into a microphone night after night because the country needed a voice, and when the island of Malta stood and bled through its siege, it was George who gave the whole of it the George Cross, an entire people honored for their courage. The 10th never ruled, yet mastered the rarest royal art, the kindness that asks for nothing. If royalty is so often confused with spectacle, Princess Alexandra, the Honorable Lady Ogilvy, is the quiet rebuttal. Cousin to the late Queen, born into all the usual privilege, she could easily have chosen a life of appearances and ceremonial filler. She went the other way, toward the overlooked corners of service. Across her lifetime, she became patron to more than 100 charities, many of which she went on supporting long after the cameras had gone. What set her apart was never the volume of her engagements, but the quality of her attention. Volunteers and charity workers describe her again and again as kind, present, and refreshingly without pretense. She remembered the small things, the birthdays and the illnesses and the family troubles, and sent handwritten notes of thanks long after the event was over. In a world where royal gestures so often feel scripted, hers rarely did. She preferred small venues to state banquets, and a long conversation with a nurse to a front-page photograph. When illness began to limit her in later years, she made no fuss. She simply carried on, declining the attention and keeping her commitments with what one aide called a total absence of royal ego. Her kindness was never flashy enough for a documentary, but to the people who received it, it was unforgettable. The 11th traded a tiara for a chalkboard and left the royal circuit by choice. If most royals fade from view through scandal or age, Katharine, Duchess of Kent, did something stranger. She simply walked away. After decades of service, she withdrew quietly from public royal life in the 1990s, and the reason was that she wished to become a music teacher, a real one in a real classroom, with real teenagers. No title on the door, no fanfare in the papers. She taught under her first name, helped struggling pupils find their confidence through music, and developed a particular devotion to children with disabilities and those from schools the system had under-resourced. Her kindness was not ceremonial, it was professional and daily and intentional. Her retreat from royal life was not a scandal, it was a redefinition. She still supports charities, but does so well out of the spotlight. And those who have worked with her describe a woman who listens far more than she speaks, and who never once uses her former status to command respect. She treats her royal history rather like an old coat, useful in cold weather and otherwise unnecessary. It would be easy to imagine her vanishing from public memory entirely, and perhaps that is exactly what she wants. What is harder to erase is the moral clarity it takes to walk away from inherited power, not in shame, but on purpose. Imagine that same instinct in Victoria's own daughter. The 12th, Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, never quite fit the mold. The 4th daughter of Queen Victoria, she was meant to be decorative and obedient, and she refused to be either. Instead, she carved out a place in history, not through open rebellion, but through a carefully cultivated compassion and a commitment to fairness that ran decades ahead of her time. Louise was an artist, a sculptor, and a passionate advocate for the education of women. At a time when women were still expected to remain elegantly ignorant, she used her position to support female artists, to pay for their training, and to break down the barriers in institutions where a woman's name was not even welcome on the building. She insisted, too, on treating her household staff as equals, eating informally with them, dropping the titles, doing away with the layers of rigid hierarchy wherever she could. Her politics were not merely fashionable, they were deeply personal. Her letters reveal a woman who believed in progress not as a slogan, but as a moral imperative. She defied her mother's expectations, defied the conventions of her sex, and gave generously to hospitals and working-class schools throughout her life, rarely taking the credit. She was not flawless, but in an age obsessed with appearances, she turned her attention toward the invisible, the workers, the women, the poor. The statue of her mother that still stands before Kensington Palace is her own work, carved by a princess in an age that did not expect its princesses to lift a chisel at all. The 13th has attended more military funerals than royal banquets. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, is not flashy, is seldom quoted, and rarely trends anywhere. And yet across several decades, he has become one of the most consistent forces of quiet dignity inside the monarchy, appearing where it matters, saying little and meaning what he does. Unlike many of his generation, he is known for no scandal and no grandstanding. He has built his legacy instead through personal involvement in more than 140 charities, many of them devoted to education, to military service, to disadvantaged youth. He does not merely lend his name, he returns, again and again, often meeting the same people year upon year. Charity staff and organizers note that he remembers names, asks precise follow-up questions, and cares far more for substance than for protocol. Those inside the palace describe him as quietly decent, attentive, a gentleman in the most unfashionable sense of the word, meaning dependable, disciplined, and deeply respectful of those without titles. He makes no sweeping speeches. He has spent decades instead, behind the scenes, making certain that obligations turn into outcomes. He does not invite the spotlight, but he is always in the room when it counts, which may be the closest the family comes to genuine reliability. For more than 50 years, he stood at the edge of the center court at Wimbledon and handed the trophies to the champions, a familiar figure to millions who never once learned his name. The 14th listens more than she speaks. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, does not dominate the headlines, and she does not appear to mind. She has become one of the most quietly respected members of the modern family, not through grand gestures, but through the consistency with which she chooses humility over spectacle. Though her work with survivors of abuse and of conflict has been described by those who know it as unusually hands-on, she is not a patron in name only. She visits the organizations privately, sits with survivors without press present, and returns without announcement. Her purpose is not to inspire a social media reel, it is to listen and to stay. Staff and charity workers describe her, over and over, as calm, grounded, and intensely focused on whoever is in front of her. She asks thoughtful questions. She follows up. And most strikingly of all, she arrives alone. with no entourage and no orchestration, sometimes early, always prepared. Her engagements often go unreported, and that appears to be by design. In a royal landscape still learning how to perform sincerity, Sophie does not perform it at all. She brings it with her, and, in time, that has made her one of the most quietly beloved figures in the household. Among the people who see how much she does when no one is watching, the 15th could have become a study in detached entitlement. Born into unimaginable privilege, raised under the gaze of the entire world, and trained for a throne from birth, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, has tried instead, imperfectly but deliberately, to become something rarer, a royal who seeks proximity rather than protection. His public work is well known, but it is behind closed doors that he has earned his reputation among palace staff for treating everyone, from senior aides to part-time drivers, with the same respect. Former employees say he knows the names of their children, sends personal notes of thanks, and meets mistakes with grace, which alone marks him out in an institution more often concerned with hierarchy than with humanity. There is his work with homelessness charities, which has included spending time on the ground to understand the conditions for himself. He has telephoned bereaved families connected to the causes he supports, not to be seen doing it, but simply to show up. His commitment to mental health is no abstraction either, and the staff note that his own way of leading reflects it: quiet, steady, and emotionally intelligent. He does not pretend to be an ordinary man. He knows he is not. But he does not wield his status either. He tries to use it as a key to open doors rather than a wall to close ranks. His environmental prize, launched to reward the people solving the planet's hardest problems, carries the same instinct, the belief that a platform is worth holding only if it lifts someone other than the person standing on it. Beside him stands the 16th, who does her homework before every handshake. If William is the quietly steady heir, Katharine, the Princess of Wales, is the measured pulse of the modern monarchy, calm and thoughtful and intensely focused, not on optics, but on preparation. Her kindness does not shout, it does not even whisper. It lives in how she prepares and listens, and holds herself back in a world forever inviting the opposite. Staff describe her as composed and considerate both on duty and off. Before she visits a charity or makes an appearance, she is known to study case histories and briefings and background notes herself, sometimes days ahead. She wants to know who she is meeting, what they have endured, and how she might actually be of use. That kind of care, so often dismissed as polish, is in truth an old-fashioned empathy in disguise. She is not performative with children. She lowers herself to their level and waits and asks. She does not rush past people in a crowd, she lingers. There is a calm to her that the staff have called soothing, particularly when the tension in a room runs high. And with the household and the aides, her manner is marked by a baseline of professional respect rather than assumed authority. She has lived under the microscope for nearly 2 decades, and she has learned to bear that gaze not by deflecting it, but by refusing to let it harden her. Her work has settled, in time, on the earliest years of childhood, the unfashionable conviction that who we become is largely shaped before we can remember any of it, and that this, of all things, deserves a nation's attention. The 17th took the same upbringing and chose the opposite road. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, is the royal most likely to divide a dinner table. But long before the interviews and the memoir and the headlines that crossed an ocean, he was something else, consistently present in the lives of people most royals only nod toward: the veterans, the wounded soldiers, the survivors of war whose pain does not make for a good photograph, but who remember exactly who kept turning up. The Invictus Games are his most famous creation, and rightly so. But what is often lost is how long he stays in touch. Years after the games are over, the competitors have spoken of how he still checks in privately, with no agenda at all. He visits hospitals with no press, writes the notes, remembers what people told him. It is not revolutionary, it is merely rare. He has always worn his heart nearer the surface than the others, sometimes nearer than the institution could comfortably bear. But behind the friction, the one thing few will dispute is that he cares, not as a symbol, but as a person. The nurses and the veterans and the volunteers all describe the same thing. He listens, and he really listens. He is present in the awkward moments, not only the celebratory ones. Whatever one makes of his choices in recent years, his kindness was not invented after he left. It is the thread that runs through the whole of him. And so to the last, perhaps the quietest of them all, whose goodness went almost entirely unseen. There is nothing flashy about Princess Beatrice. No great scandal, no tabloid drama, no sweeping reinvention, which may be why her kindness rarely reached a front page. But among the people who have worked with her, especially in the world of advocacy, she has earned a quiet and durable reputation for emotional intelligence, for humility, and for consistency. She has long been open about her own dyslexia, and rather than turn it into a branding moment, she has used it to support children facing the same struggle, offering not only speeches but real mentorship, and time, and her presence. She has worked with dyslexia charities for years, not as a figurehead, but as someone who sits in the strategy sessions and listens to the educators. She has lent quiet time to support and advocacy work as well, away from any fanfare. Colleagues describe her as kind and warm and deeply empathetic, and note that she remembers the smallest things about the people she meets. A family member, a worry, an offhand remark, and follows up on them. Her humility is not a cultivated persona. It is simply how she moves through a room. In an institution so often accused of performing its concern, Beatrice seems to have chosen another mode entirely. Less throne and more backbone, less spotlight and more follow-through, which leaves the lingering question. In a system built to elevate image over substance, how did these 18 manage to choose kindness anyway? Perhaps that is the point of telling it. The crowns are remembered for their sparkle. These people are remembered, by the few who knew them, for something that lasted longer. Tell me in the comments which detail changed the way you see this story. I read every single comment. Subscribe to the Royal Thread. Every story is connected, and the next thread is already being pulled.